They couldn't believe their eyes. The German soldiers who surrounded the smoking wreck in the French countryside in 1943 had seen plenty of Allied bombers fall from the sky before. But this one was different, mostly intact, engines still ticking with heat, its gun turrets eerily silent. A flying fortress, a B-17. The Luftwaffe men circled it like wolves around some mythical beast. The name, Flying Fortress, had been a boast, a propaganda term to the Germans. But seeing it up close, riddled with flak holes yet still mostly whole, that boast felt justified. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fuel and burned metal. Bullet holes dotted the fuselage like scars, but the machine, impossibly, had survived long enough to crash land instead of disintegrating. For months, the Luftwaffe had been facing waves of these bombers, high-altitude formations that darkened the sky. They came in hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 strong, escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts and later by the sleek, deadly P-51 Mustangs. The Germans called them Wehrmachts, four-motored monsters that shrugged off small arms fire and could take terrifying punishment before going down. This one had been part of a formation targeting a ball-bearing plant deep in occupied France. Flak batteries had opened up, fighters had attacked, and somehow, this one had limped out of formation, smoke trailing behind it. The pilot, dead or gone, had managed a crash landing in a field near Nantes. Now, Luftwaffe officers stood staring at their prize. They called in engineers, intelligence officers, and even pilots from local airfields. The aircraft was quickly secured, its insignia painted over with black crosses. It would soon be shipped to Rechlin, Germany's secret air testing base, the same place where the Luftwaffe had examined captured Spitfires, Mustangs, and Russian Yak fighters. But the B-17 was something else entirely. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't agile. It was enormous, a fortress with wings. When the Luftwaffe engineers climbed inside, what they found left them stunned. Every few feet, there was a gun. A Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun, here in the nose, there in the chin turret, the waist positions, the tail. 13 in total, each paired with belts of ammunition, each carefully placed to cover a different angle of attack. It was a spider's web of firepower. German intelligence officers took notes, muttering to themselves in disbelief. One of them reportedly said, "No wonder they fly in formation, this thing is a flying city." The armor plating around the cockpit, the bulletproof glass, the self-sealing fuel tanks, it was all designed for one thing: survival. Soon, the order came down from Berlin, the bomber was to be repaired, refueled, and flown by Luftwaffe pilots for testing. Within days, a crew of hand-picked men, pilots, engineers, and gunnery experts, arrived from Rechlin. They called the project Butflugzeug, Captured Aircraft Program. Among them was Hauptmann Hans Werner Lurk, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled test pilots, who had flown nearly every enemy aircraft captured during the war. When he first saw the B-17 up close, his reaction was recorded in his diary: "It looks like a fortress built for the sky." The Americans do not build machines, they build philosophies. Lurk's job was to understand how the bomber worked, its performance, its weaknesses, its strengths. The aircraft was repaired with salvaged parts, its engines restored. Within weeks it was flying again, this time, with black crosses painted on its wings and a German pilot at the controls. When the engines roared to life, the ground shook. The crew marveled at how smooth it ran, the Wright Cyclone engines humming evenly despite the wear. From the cockpit, visibility was limited, but everything felt solid, over-engineered in a way that seemed almost alien to German design. The control yoke felt heavy but reassuring, the bomber responded like a giant that knew its own power. Once airborne, Lurk tested its climb, its turn radius, its endurance. What impressed him most wasn't the performance, the B-17 wasn't fast, but its stability. "It feels as if it cannot die," he wrote. "Even wounded, it keeps flying." Then came the gunnery tests. German crews manned the bombers' turrets while Luftwaffe fighters staged mock attacks from different angles. What they saw was a revelation. Each gun's field of fire overlapped perfectly with another's. A Bf-109 diving from above was met with crossfire from the top and tail turrets. A Focke-Wulf attacking head-on was shredded by twin .50 calibers in the chin. Even attacks from below were dangerous. The ball turret spun like an angry insect, spitting tracers in every direction. To the Germans who had spent years perfecting the art of aerial attack, this was something new, a machine designed not to outmaneuver, but to endure. After one exercise, a Luftwaffe colonel watching from the ground turned to his adjutant and said quietly, "It is not an airplane. It is a gun platform that happens to fly." Word spread quickly through the Luftwaffe's ranks. For the first time, they truly understood why their pilots were dying in such numbers attacking the bomber streams. One B-17 could be tough to bring down, but in formation, dozens of them created an interlocking wall of gunfire that chewed through even the best German aces. The Americans had designed something that was more than just a bomber. It was a fortress in the sky, and it terrified even the men who flew it. At Rechlin, Lurk and his team prepared their final report for Berlin. It was both an admiration and a warning. The B-17 could not be underestimated. Its firepower, armor, and reliability made it one of the most dangerous machines in the war. But as they sent their findings up the chain of command, no one could know that this single captured aircraft, and the men who flew it, would become part of one of the most dramatic shifts in air warfare. The Luftwaffe had seen the future, but the question remained, could they stop it? When the captured B-17 first touched down at Rechlin Air Base under German control, engineers and officers crowded around it as if it were a newly discovered alien craft. The Americans had given it a name that sounded like propaganda, Flying Fortress, but now, standing in front of one, even the skeptics could see why. The Luftwaffe's technical division had tested dozens of Allied aircraft before, Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, even Soviet Yaks, but this was something else entirely. Fighters were built for agility, for one-on-one duels. The B-17 was built for endurance, for survival through sheer defiance of physics. As technicians examined the plane inch by inch, they noted the thick armor plating under the cockpit and around the fuel tanks, the redundant control systems that allowed pilots to maintain flight even when hydraulics failed, the layers of self-sealing material protecting the fuel lines. Every part seemed to have been designed by people who assumed they would be shot at constantly, and planned for it. In the control room overlooking the hangar, Luftwaffe engineers debated how this philosophy could even work. Too heavy, one said. Too slow, another added. But the chief engineer pointed to the gun mounts and said, "Yes, but you cannot attack it. You cannot find a blind spot." To understand it fully, the Luftwaffe wanted to fly it like an American would. They called in experienced bomber pilots from Kampfgeschwader 100 and 200, Germany's elite special operations air units, along with test pilot Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurk once again. Together, they began a methodical series of flight tests. On the morning of the first mission, the airbase buzzed with curiosity. The bomber's American markings had been painted over with Luftwaffe crosses, and a handful of German crewmen, wearing captured flight jackets, climbed aboard. Lurk sat in the pilot's seat, hands resting on the unfamiliar yoke. The cockpit was enormous compared to German designs. Dials, gauges, and levers filled every inch of the panel, labeled in English. "It is like flying a machine built by engineers who never feared complexity," he muttered. The engines fired one by one, a deep, throaty rumble that echoed across the field. Ground crew members covered their ears. The B-17 taxied slowly, its bulk almost majestic in motion. Once airborne, Lurk put the bomber through its paces. It wasn't fast, barely topping 280 miles per hour, but what shocked him was how steady it felt. Even with one engine throttled down, the aircraft held course effortlessly. When he deliberately cut another engine to simulate damage, the plane still stayed level, refusing to falter. Most Luftwaffe bombers would have spun into a dive. After landing, the test pilots gathered in the debriefing room, shaking their heads. "It flies like it wants to stay alive," Lurk said. The next phase of testing involved simulated attacks. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, were ordered to perform mock interception runs. At first, the pilots were amused. They thought it would be easy. But as soon as the first Focke-Wulf dove in from above, tracer fire erupted from nearly every angle of the bomber. Even without live ammunition, the pattern of overlapping fire was clear. Every approach vector was covered by at least one turret. The Luftwaffe quickly realized that attacking a single B-17 was suicidal enough, attacking one inside a formation was madness. The Americans flew them in tight, disciplined groups, each covering the other's blind spots. The result was a defensive sphere that turned the sky itself into a killing zone. During one test, a German pilot approached too closely from the rear, trying to simulate a tail attack. The mock gunnery crew aboard the B-17 tracked him perfectly with the twin .50 caliber tail guns. "If they were live rounds," the pilot said later, "I'd be dead before I reached firing range." The Luftwaffe's after-action report was blunt: the B-17 defensive system is unlike any bomber previously encountered. Attacks from the rear, below, and above result in high casualties. Approach from the front remains extremely dangerous. For German fighter squadrons, already bleeding men at a terrible rate, this information only deepened their dread. They had been calling the American formations Fliegenfestungen, flying fortresses, long before this test. Now, it wasn't just a nickname. It was truth. But the Luftwaffe's interest in the captured B-17 wasn't purely technical. The war was turning against Germany, and desperation often bred creativity. In the fall of 1943, a daring idea emerged: use the captured bomber as a decoy. The plan was to disguise it completely, to repaint it in American markings and send it up to infiltrate bomber formations or confuse Allied radar operators. Special units like Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's secret operations wing, were experts in deception. They had flown captured Spitfires and B-24s before. Why not a B-17? For weeks, mechanics worked to restore the bomber to near-perfect American appearance. Its Staranbar insignia returned. English markings were re-stenciled. Even its radio frequencies were tuned to match those of U.S. bombers. The deception was so convincing that when it was flown near an Allied formation for testing, American gunners nearly didn't fire. The operation, though ingenious, was short-lived. The risk of being recognized or shot down by both sides was too great. Still, it left an impression on those who saw it: a German bomber painted like its enemy, a ghost in the sky. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's fascination with the B-17 had evolved into reluctant respect. Officers who had once mocked Allied engineering began to speak of American design philosophy with awe. "They build for survival," one report concluded. "We build for performance." And yet, that very difference defined the outcome of the air war. Germany's sleek, high-performance machines dazzled on the test range, but the Americans built aircraft that could be mass-produced, maintained easily, and survive punishment. At Rechlin, the captured B-17 was still flying, still teaching lessons. Every officer who stepped aboard left with the same thought: if one of these can survive this much firepower, what happens when 1,000 come together? The answer would soon come, in the skies over Germany itself. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's intelligence reports were filled with grim statistics. Each day brought new losses, new names to cross off rosters. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber anymore, it was a symbol of an industrial machine that refused to break. From Hamburg to Stuttgart, from Schweinfurt to Berlin, the flying fortresses were rewriting the very nature of aerial warfare. The Germans had learned everything they could from their captured B-17. They had mapped its blind spots, analyzed its structure, even studied its turret mechanisms. And yet, when the real waves came, nothing they knew seemed to matter. At first, the sky would be quiet, a few scattered contrails drifting far above the clouds. Then, as the minutes passed, the horizon would darken. Tiny specks appeared, multiplying until the formation stretched from one end of the sky to the other. Dozens. Hundreds. 1,000 bombers flying in perfect, unwavering precision. Every German pilot who saw it for the first time felt the same dread. The roar was unlike anything else, not the scream of dive bombers or the whine of fighters, but a deep, thunderous hum that seemed to shake the earth itself. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up, filling the sky with black bursts of flak, but the formation kept coming, steady and unstoppable. From below, it looked like a single, living organism. Every B-17 was part of a machine larger than itself, each gunner covering the gaps of his neighbors. The result was a storm of defensive fire so dense that Luftwaffe pilots described it as flying into a wall of tracers. Captain Walter Dahl, a German ace who had survived countless dogfights, later wrote, "It was like charging into a volcano. You didn't attack the formation, you attacked fate itself." The B-17s had been designed to do exactly that, to make direct assaults suicidal. Even before a German fighter got close enough to fire, it would be met with streams of .50 caliber bullets from every direction. The air around the bombers shimmered with tracers, casings, and smoke. From his cockpit, one German pilot saw a B-17 take 3 direct hits from flak, one engine trailing fire, and yet it stayed in formation. "They kept flying even when they should have fallen," he later said. It was as if the planes themselves refused to die. For the men inside the flying fortresses, survival was a matter of teamwork and willpower. Gunners shouted over intercoms, calling out targets, "Bandit, 2 o'clock high." As fighters swarmed in. The air vibrated with the recoil of the Brownings. In the freezing altitudes over Germany, the noise was deafening. Each turret worked independently yet in perfect rhythm, nose, chin, top, tail, and waist gunners weaving a symphony of destruction. The Luftwaffe pilots darting through the formation called it "hell in motion." Even when one bomber went down, the others filled the gap within seconds, maintaining the deadly lattice of fire. In one mission over Schweinfurt, 60 German fighters were sent up to intercept. By the time they broke off, 18 had been shot down, and nearly all the survivors returned home riddled with bullet holes. Some pilots refused to go up again. "It's suicide," one was heard saying. "Those things aren't bombers, they're fortresses." At the same time, the Luftwaffe's resources were crumbling. Fuel shortages, exhausted pilots, and the constant pressure of Allied bombing raids made training new airmen nearly impossible. The veterans were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Meanwhile, the Americans just kept coming. The B-17's true strength wasn't just its guns, it was the factory lines behind them. While German plants struggled to replace even a few lost aircraft, the United States was building fortresses by the hundreds every month. One German intelligence officer captured late in the war admitted, "We thought we were fighting the American Air Force. We were fighting American industry." Still, the Germans tried everything. They changed tactics, attacking from the front instead of the rear to exploit weak spots. They experimented with rockets, with twin-engine heavy fighters, even with ramming attacks. But none of it changed the reality: the B-17 formations were too coordinated, too disciplined, too well-armed. At Luftwaffe headquarters, officers studied the reports from the captured B-17 at Rechlin again, searching for some overlooked weakness. But the conclusion was always the same: the design was simple, rugged, and brutally effective. The irony was that the Germans had underestimated simplicity. They believed engineering perfection lay in precision, in sleek fighters like the Me-109 or Me-262 jet. The Americans believed it lay in practicality, in machines that could be mass-produced, repaired in the field, and flown by ordinary men. By early 1944, the evidence was everywhere. The B-17 had become a nightmare that no amount of German ingenuity could stop. Its bomb loads tore through refineries, rail lines, and factories. Cities that once powered the Reich's war machine were now smoldering ruins. At Rechlin, Luftwaffe test pilots continued to fly their captured B-17 in mock combat exercises, still hoping to find the secret that made it so unstoppable. After one such flight, a German officer reportedly remarked, "Now I understand the Americans. They build weapons not to win a battle, but to make losing impossible." As spring turned to summer, even Göring, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe, began to feel the strain. He had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever fly over Germany. Now, entire cities vanished beneath the bombs dropped by those very unflyable machines. The German pilots who had once mocked the flying fortress now spoke of it with awe. The men who had flown the captured bomber wrote detailed reports praising its construction, its stability, and above all, its defensive coordination. In a final note to the Luftwaffe's technical division, one of them wrote simply, "We did not know a machine could defend itself like that." But even as they admired the engineering genius of their enemy, the Germans were witnessing something far greater than a single aircraft design. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber. It was proof that America had mastered the art of industrial war, and the skies over Europe would soon belong entirely to those flying fortresses. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer win. Its once proud fighter arm, which had ruled the skies over Europe in the early years, was now being ground to dust under the weight of American industry and coordination. Every week, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses appeared over the Reich, each carrying thousands of pounds of bombs, each shielded by an invisible fortress of gunfire. The German High Command was desperate. Hermann Göring, once so confident that no enemy bomber will ever reach the Ruhr, now stood before a shattered air force, demanding miracles. "Destroy the bombers," he thundered. "If you cannot, destroy yourselves trying." From their intelligence offices, Luftwaffe analysts pored over captured American manuals, reports from the test B-17 at Rechlin, and combat footage. They searched for the weak point in the machine, the flaw in the strategy. But the truth was devastating: there was no single weakness. The flying fortress was not unbeatable individually, but it was nearly invincible as a team. So the Luftwaffe turned to extremes. One tactic involved frontal attacks, head-on charges where fighters dove directly into the bomber streams. It was suicidal, but it worked, sometimes. American gunners had less time to react, and the nose armor was thinner. But for every B-17 downed, 2 or 3 German fighters were lost. "You only had one pass," recalled a surviving pilot. "After that, you were either dead or out of ammunition." To bolster their defenses, German engineers rolled out new weapons, 30mm cannons, aerial rockets, and even upward-firing guns called Schrägmusik, jazz music, mounted on night fighters. They tested these against the captured B-17 at Rechlin, analyzing firing angles and impact results. The findings were promising, but in practice, they came too late. The bombers were already escorted by long-range fighters, the dreaded P-51 Mustangs that roamed freely across Germany. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now ruled by these slender, silver hunters. American pilots flew in perfect coordination with the bombers, darting in to cut down German attackers before they could even line up their shots. "We could no longer reach the fortresses," one German pilot lamented. "The Mustangs guarded them like hawks." Still, the Germans tried. At airfields across the Reich, the last of their elite squadrons prepared for missions they knew were hopeless. They climbed into cockpits patched with bullet holes, fueled with synthetic gasoline that barely powered their engines, and faced odds no sane pilot would accept. The order was always the same: intercept the bombers, no matter the cost. By this stage, the Luftwaffe had deployed its most advanced weapons, the Me-262 jet fighter, capable of speeds no piston-engine aircraft could match. It was sleek, deadly, and revolutionary. Göring believed it would change the war. But even the Me-262 couldn't save Germany. There were too few of them, too little fuel, and not enough trained pilots. When the jets did appear, slicing through the bomber formations at blistering speed, the B-17 crews were stunned. But the Americans adapted quickly. They changed formations, tightened defensive fire, and even deployed new radar-guided escort tactics. The Me-262s might have been the future, but the B-17s, backed by thousands of engines and millions of tons of supplies, were the present. The captured B-17 at Rechlin continued to serve as a teaching tool throughout this period. Luftwaffe pilots and gunners trained against it, learning how to approach without getting torn apart. They studied its turrets, its gunnery arcs, and its cockpit layout. Every lesson confirmed the same thing: the Americans had built a war machine that emphasized endurance, communication, and coordination over everything else. One German gunnery officer summarized it perfectly: they have designed their aircraft to take punishment we cannot imagine. And they have enough of them to never stop. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, American bomber crews were enduring unimaginable losses, but they kept flying. For every 10 B-17s that didn't return, 20 more took off the next morning. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Kansas City churned them out like clockwork. Replacement crews arrived weekly. The system was self-sustaining, unstoppable. By late 1944, the Allied air forces were dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities every single day. Berlin, once the proud heart of the Reich, burned under a sky filled with the same flying fortresses that Göring had once laughed at. The German pilots still fighting compared it to facing a storm. You couldn't stop it, you could only try to survive it. They knew their war was ending, but some flew anyway, driven by duty, pride, or simply the desire to protect their homeland one last time. In the ruins of the airfields, the test B-17 at Rechlin was eventually grounded for lack of fuel and spare parts. The engineers had stripped it bare, documenting every inch of its structure. Its final flight, sometime in early 1945, ended not in battle, but in silence. The aircraft that had once been a symbol of curiosity and defiance now sat under a gray sky, surrounded by the dying remnants of the Luftwaffe. And above it, in that same sky, real B-17s thundered toward the heart of Germany. For the men who had flown the captured bomber, it was a haunting sight. They had once sat inside its cockpit, felt the hum of its engines, seen the world from behind its guns. Now they watched from the ground as hundreds of identical machines passed overhead, unstoppable, inevitable. One of them, a pilot named Oberleutnant Karl Hagedorn, later said, "When I looked up and saw them coming, I realized we had lost not just the air, but the war itself." No army can stand against the sky when the sky belongs to machines like that. The Luftwaffe had gambled everything on innovation, on speed, on the skill of its aces. The Americans had bet on endurance, organization, and mass production. In the end, it wasn't the faster or the more beautiful aircraft that decided the skies over Europe, it was the one that simply refused to fall. And as the flying fortresses rolled across the heavens, the lesson of that captured B-17 was carved forever into history: power, in modern war, belonged not to those who fought hardest, but to those who could keep fighting the longest. When the war finally ended in 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were craters, its factories rubble, and its airfields graveyards of burned-out aircraft. The once mighty Luftwaffe, the pride of Göring's vision, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. And above the wreckage, the skies were silent, save for the distant drone of Allied planes ferrying men and supplies across a broken continent. Among the wrecks at Rechlin Air Base sat the battered remains of the captured B-17. Its paint was faded, its markings a strange blend of American stars and German crosses, a relic of a time when it had served both sides, and belonged to neither. The engineers who had studied it were gone. Some were prisoners, some were missing, and others were quietly being recruited by the victors. But the lessons they had learned from that single machine would linger long after the war. In interrogation rooms across Europe, Allied intelligence officers questioned captured Luftwaffe generals about their experiences fighting the flying fortresses. The responses were remarkably consistent: admiration mixed with frustration. General Adolf Galland, the famed German ace, described them as machines that fought back. He admitted that the Americans had achieved something the Germans never could, a true integration of technology, production, and human coordination. The Fortress, he said, was not just an aircraft. It was a philosophy. Others echoed his sentiment. To the Luftwaffe, the B-17 represented more than firepower. It represented a mindset, one that valued reliability over brilliance, quantity over complexity, teamwork over individual heroics. The Germans had built marvels of engineering, aircraft like the FW-190, the Me-262, the Arado jets, but they were fragile, difficult to maintain, and few in number. The Americans built weapons that could survive damage, be repaired quickly, and be flown by thousands. In the ruins of the Reich, even former enemies began to understand the scale of that achievement. The U.S. had built over 12,000 B-17s, and more than twice that number of other heavy bombers. They had blanketed Europe with logistics, airfields, and supply chains so vast that German officers compared it to an invasion of the sky itself. When Allied investigators inspected the captured B-17 at Rechlin after the war, they found that the Germans had treated it almost reverently. The aircraft systems had been carefully maintained. Its flight logs were detailed, its engines still preserved under tarps. Notes written by Luftwaffe engineers in pencil lined its interior, observations about the armor, the turret controls, and the way the crew positions were arranged for communication and efficiency. One engineer had written a simple line inside the fuselage, built to save its men. That line captured what so many Luftwaffe officers had come to realize. The Americans hadn't designed their bombers as disposable machines, they had designed them as lifeboats. Every component, every radio, every inch of armor existed to give the crew a chance to come home. It was a philosophy that reflected something larger about the nation that built it. In post-war interviews, German pilots often confessed a kind of respect for their old adversaries. They spoke of missions where damaged B-17s, streaming smoke, still managed to limp back across the channel. They remembered seeing wounded bombers peel away from formation, engines dying, only to level out and vanish into the clouds, still flying, still alive. To them, it was almost supernatural. They did not just build machines, one Luftwaffe colonel said years later. They built faith into metal. The captured B-17's influence didn't end in 1945. The engineers who studied it helped shape post-war aircraft designs, not only in Germany but across Europe. Its lessons in redundancy, crew protection, and system durability became part of the DNA of modern aviation. Even in the Cold War years, when jet bombers replaced the lumbering fortresses, the same philosophy endured: build planes that can take hits, keep flying, and protect their crews. For the Americans, the B-17 became a symbol of both devastation and endurance. It had helped turn the tide of war, but at a terrible cost. Thousands of crews never returned home. Yet even in loss, the aircraft's reputation only grew. In museums and airshows, veterans would stand beneath the wings of surviving B-17s and run their hands along the riveted panels, remembering the sound of the engines, the feel of the vibration, the teamwork that had kept them alive. And across the Atlantic, in Germany, the memory lingered too. Former Luftwaffe pilots, now old men, would sometimes visit those same museums. They would stare at the olive-drab fuselages and whisper the same words they had once written in their reports: Fliegen Festung. One of them, interviewed decades later, smiled when asked what he had thought of the B-17 after flying the captured one. It was heavy, noisy, and slow, he said. But it never quit. And that's why we lost. He paused, then added softly, we had genius. They had persistence. Persistence wins wars. In the end, that was the legacy of the Flying Fortress, and of the German officers who had once mocked it, then marveled at it. It wasn't speed or glamour that ruled the skies of the 20th century. It was resilience, organization, and the will to endure. The B-17 proved that victory doesn't always belong to the most elegant design or the boldest idea. Sometimes, it belongs to the machine that just refuses to fall from the sky. And for those who once studied it from the enemy's side, that realization came too late. The fortress had flown, and with it, a new age of warfare was born.